I want to start by saying that I lead a fairly straightforward lifestyle. No alcohol, no drugs. So I can confidently say what I experienced last New Year's Eve was 100% real and not some hallucination or drunken daze. I live just outside a typical small southern town where a few of my friends live even further out in the countryside, only accessible by dark and winding back roads. One of these friends, Darren, lives in a wealthy neighborhood that you can only reach by taking one of these roads. Every year, his family hosts a New Year's Eve party, inviting friends and family, myself included. It's always a fun time, and I look forward to the formal invitation they send out. In the South, winters can be unpredictable. That year, the cold only really settled in a few days before New Year's Eve. I remember the icy air and the uncomfortable drive on those bumpy, unkempt back roads. Usually, I avoid using my car's high beams because I dislike blinding other drivers, but the pitch black roads and sharp curves made them necessary that night. The road to Darren's place is bordered by dense trees on both sides, with no houses along the way, except for an old, seemingly abandoned shack. Occasionally, I've noticed lights on inside, but it always looked deserted. As I drove down a straight stretch of road, my headlights illuminated something unusual among the trees, a figure in white standing by the roadside. It was a woman in a long dress, utterly inappropriate for the freezing weather. She stood still, her back to the trees, and didn't move as I passed. I didn't stop, but felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she might need help. Glancing in my rearview mirror, I saw her turn to face my car, still standing motionless. A chill ran down my spine. I arrived at Darren's house without further incident. The party was lively, and we celebrated until midnight. Afterward, as guests started leaving, I stayed back to help clean up, finally heading out around 2 a.m. When I got into my car, a low tire pressure light came on. This wasn't unusual in cold weather, so I figured I'd make it home without issue. I considered taking an alternate, longer route to avoid the eerie back road, but I decided against it. Not long into the drive, my car started making unsettling noises, and I was forced to pull over. To my horror, all four tires had been shredded, as if by some animal or deliberate sabotage. Stuck in the middle of nowhere with no phone signal, I felt a growing sense of dread. Then, the eerie silence of the forest was broken by the sound of footsteps and a soft voice. "I see you," a woman's voice said, coming from the trees. Paralyzed with fear, I shone my flashlight toward the sound, and there she was, the woman in white. Her appearance was grotesque, her dress stained, her hair unkempt, and her face disfigured. In a panic, I ran back to Darren's house, banging on the door for help. Darren's parents let me in, and I explained everything. They called the police and offered me a place to stay for the night. But as I tried to sleep, a tapping on the second-story window woke me up. At 3:14 a.m., I heard her voice again. "I see you." She had followed me all the way back to Darren's house. Terrified, I stayed frozen in bed until morning. The next day, the police found no sign of her, but they did discover a rusty knife near the house and evidence of slaughtered animals in the woods by the shack. The woman was never found, leaving so many questions unanswered. Despite this, I'll be going to Darren's for New Year's Eve again this year. But this time, I'll take the long way and definitely won't be driving alone. Here's the rephrased transcript in an international style for clarity and brevity. At 10:40, I was reflecting on a recent trip. A few days ago, I booked a late-night flight home, landing at midnight. By the time I reached the ground transportation area, it was 12:30 a.m. I flagged down a random taxi from the designated area and shared my address. The driver offered to take me for $30, which was a better deal than Uber. He helped with my luggage, and I opted to keep it beside me rather than placing it in the trunk. The drive to my apartment, about 30 minutes away without traffic, started smoothly. However, during the ride, the driver kept glancing at me in the mirror. He asked where I was coming from and what I was doing there. When I mentioned visiting a friend, he made an unsettling comment, asking if my friend was as pretty as me. His questions continued on a flirty, intrusive note, making me increasingly uncomfortable. As we approached my exit, he drove past it despite my repeated instructions. He apologized and said he'd take the next exit, but I began to feel uneasy. At the next exit, I insisted he take it, and he finally complied, though his demeanor became more unsettling. He then asked if I had a boyfriend and even pressed for his name. At that point, I pretended to listen to music by putting in my AirPods and texted my family and friends, sharing my live location for safety. When we stopped at a red light, the driver stared at me menacingly through the mirror. Feeling uneasy, I noticed a police car parked nearby and made a split-second decision to grab my belongings, open the van door, and run to the officer. The driver yelled but didn't chase me. Instead, he drove off, a significant red flag. The officer gave me a ride home, and I was safe for the night. However, later that night, there was persistent knocking at my apartment door. I feared it might be the taxi driver, since he had my address. The knocking eventually stopped, and I went to sleep. The next day, my neighbor called to inform me that someone resembling my dad was trying to enter my apartment. I called my dad, who confirmed he hadn't been there, heightening my suspicions. That evening, while preparing to leave for my parents' home, I felt uneasy, as though I wasn't alone. Hearing a creak from the spare bedroom, I turned to see a man partially step into view, claiming he wasn't going to hurt me. Panicking, I ran to my neighbor's house, and we called the police. The intruder fled through the backyard, and the officers couldn't locate him. Unfortunately, I didn't have identifying details for the taxi driver, but I provided a description and route information. I stayed with my parents for a week while installing security cameras at my apartment. Since then, I've taken precautions, including carrying a taser, avoiding taxis, and prioritizing safety measures. To this day, I wonder whether that taxi driver was legitimate or someone with malicious intent in a stolen vehicle.